What you want? You want to cover it up?
I'm not sure.
How about this?
Om Jnanati Mirandasya Jnanandana Salakaya Chakshuritam Yena Tasmai Shri Namaha Ajunulambita Pujo Kanakavadato Sankirtanaika Pitaro Kamalaya Chaksho Vishwambaro Dvijavaro Yugadharma Alu Vande Jagat Priyakaro Karunavataru Vande Shri Krishna Chaitanya Nityananda Sahodito Gauraya Pushpavanto Chitra Sandho Namo Vandeham Shri Ramakrishna Abhaya Charanosato Sukado Paramanando Sundaro Suvalopriyo He Krishna Karuna Sindho Dinabandhu Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radhakanta Namaste Tapta Kanchana Gourangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Namami Haripriye Shri Vaishnava Parampara ki jai Gopal ki jai Shri Tirobhava Shri Jiva Goswami Tirobhava ki jai Gaur Bhakta Vrinda ki jai Gaur Premananda. So good morning, everyone. We're gathered on the auspicious occasion of the Tirobhava remembrance of Jiva Goswami Prabhupada. May he bless us all with his knowledge, his bhakti. I'll say something, few words about Jiva Goswami. You have been, prior to my entering here this morning, reciting the Sada Goswami Astakam of Srinivasa Acharya, who was in the second generation, if you will, of disciples coming after the six Goswamis. It was initiated by Gopal Bhatta Goswami, and the sixth year was Jiva Goswami Prabhupada, so we knew them very well, very beautifully and profoundly about them. That Sad Goswami Astakam was a favorite prayer of my Guru Maharaj, who is one of the few persons who put the Astakam to music. Pujapad Sridhar Maharaj was quite surprised and pleased to hear Prabhupada's musical rendering of the Sad Goswami Astakam, about which he said the very sound of that he has put this to, the meter, the rhyme, whatever, the music of it is synonymous with the meaning. You find the meaning, the sound, even if you don't know the words, you listen carefully. So, suffice to say, my Guru Maharaj was a staunch follower of the six Goswamis of the world, the founding really charges of holy Vaishnavism. Sometimes we extend that to include Kaviraj Krishnadas Goswami, who penned, of course, Chaitanya Charitamrita, which was his effort and successful at that attempt to put into Bengali, to the common folk, the essence of the teachings of the Goswamis that they had put into Sanskrit. Among them, Jiva Goswami was the most prolific, and it was the most philosophical. His texts more heady more philosophical in nature than the poetry of the Goswami. It's not the Goswami. And it's the same more prolific as well. It's said that he composed 25 books, but it's also said, I believe, in Chaitanya Charitamrita that he composed 400,000 verses, which would make him second only to Vyasa himself in terms of the volume of original Sanskrit compositions about the nature of the Absolute. So, very prolific writer. The youngest of the 6 Goswamis. We have information about him and everyone of the associates of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, largely in terms of their lives after the passing of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Descriptions in 2 books, primarily Vilas from the middle of the 16th century, which is written in Bengali. Bhakti Ratnakar of one of the names coming. No, it was written a century later from Punjab. Historical books, but not looked at, I would say, from a modern historical point of view as being something that's actually historically accurate, which is a very inaccurate science or discipline, because obviously it relies upon the partial information from different periods of time received from not always directly from people in the time and how they felt about it, so on and so forth. But Indian history at large is like that to an extent. And as I think I mentioned the other day, it's more about capturing the essence of the feeling of the time than it is concerned about plot, I think really that point, or about necessarily all the details, all the dots completely connecting. We want to do this by the historical renderings, bring us into the feeling of the event, the feeling of the time, the precedence, over the details, which could vary from one teller, historian, writer, or another, which they take the liberty to even change the details to bring out the feeling. That's what's important. So we do therefore have regard for those texts. But again, they're mostly written about the lives of the associates after the passing of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So there's little information, but some passed down to the oral tradition, a little bit in Chaitanya Charitamrita and so forth. I cited there Kaviraj Goswami's glorification of the luminous nature of the written, composition or contribution of Jiva Goswami. And we know, of course, I should say also with regard to historical information and that which might be more accurate from a modern historical point of view, we have the genealogy of Jiva Goswami, his family lineage. He himself is added, which was customary to do. The end of his Lagutoshan commentary on Srimad Bhagavatam, very closely to Sanatana Goswami's. So there we find that his uncles, Sanatana, his father, it appears they received. These are names that it appears that they, is that better? That they received from Chaitanya Mahaprabhu himself. We have the names, titles of Rupa and Sanatana that they received from their service in the government, Muslim government. These are the only names we have, Rupa Sanatana, and they were immediate. Immediately, they were taught personally by Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So, this family lineage of Jiva Goswami is mentioned there, and the fact that it derives from, I believe, must be Gaur Brahmin community in South India. Not sure what part of South India, but that at a certain point in their family, then relatives of Jiva Goswami relocated in Ramkeli in Bengal. And there we find that he appeared as a son of Bala, the nephew of Rupa and Sanatana Goswami. Sanatana was the elder of the three brothers. Then Rupa. No, I think Rupa was second and Bala was third. But they, at least Rupa and Sanatana, they were scooped up, so to speak, by the Nawab Hussain Sahib, who was ruling, administrating there in that area of Muslim occupation of India. And there's a story to that regard. I heard Dr. Vedanta Narayan actually, not a friend, but it's a nice story. And I don't know if I can fully recall it, but it's worth saying something about. The Nawab had a number of people, many people, engaged in building his eventual tomb, where he would be laid to rest upon his demise, and he wanted to be more beautiful than Taj Mahal, which is a similar thing, as much as it's really just a tomb of Muslim ruler, as far as I recall. So that was apparently excuse me, a good part of his understanding of the significance of the afterlife. Leave behind some tomb where people remember your deeds and greatness as you perceive it on earth. At any rate, they were building the tomb, and I believe one of the builders or architects, how did it go? He was asked him something. Yeah, he said, look really good, and the architect says, well, I could have done better, and maybe he referred to some other place or something like that in comparison. And so the Nawab, what did he do? He wanted to. He didn't want it. He's able to do it better, so they wanted to run. So, but I think he asked him a question. He asked him a question, and like, do you know somebody better or something like that?
After that, he said, get it. Get it.
Anyway, there was some question or some order, and he escaped. And on the loose, if you will, he happened to run into young Rupa and Sanatana, who could see that he was troubled. And by just looking at him, they could understand his mind. And they asked him about what was troubling him, and he told. And the Nawab had asked him to bring somebody, I think, maybe he said, bring that guy that can do better or something like that. But he had just didn't know what he exactly wanted. He just got out of the way. And if he didn't, come back and fulfill the Nawab's order, he would have had his head taken off. So Rupa Goswami, he wasn't sure what the Nawab wanted, and Rupa Goswami, after hearing the story, understood what the Nawab would have wanted, and said, "This is what he would have wanted. This is what he's asking me." And so then I guess he went and brought that guy or something, and the Nawab said, "How can you figure out what I wanted?" I was so angry at that time. I was ready to cut off your head, something like that. And then he said, "Well, these fellows on that." So the Nawab said, "I want to meet them. Bring them here." So this is the story. Somebody that's actually brought these young Rups and often the uncles of Jiva Goswami, who were very extraordinary people, even from the material point of view. They spoke many languages, they were cultured people. And it would appeared from the Hindu community at the time that they were deviating from the Hindu standards of behavior, conduct, association, and so forth, by way of taking service in the government of the Muslims, which they didn't really have a choice, because if the Nawab said, "I want you to work for me," you pretty much had to do that. And of course, he gave them very high positions in the government, so much so that Sanatana was in charge of the government when the king went out on some journey, some battle or whatever it may have been. So he understood these were very cultural, valuable people. And I think we can look at this accurately from the point of view of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's orchestrating a Leela, bringing his associates and empowering them in different ways. Rupa Sanatana, Jiva Goswami, the 6 Goswamis in general, being those whom he chose to be the leaders of his mission, by way of establishing a sampradaya through a body of literature and scriptural canon, to developing the places of Krishna's Leelas in Vrindavan and establishing the virtues, the glory of Vrindavan, and to set an example by their character. Not asked to do these things. I think there were 4 things. But at any rate, in terms of his desire to single them out for this, looking at Rupa Sanatana in particular, but it holds true for the other Goswamis. But in particular with Rupa Sanatana, we can see they're working for the Nawab Hussain Sahib, which was ostracized them from the Hindu community, was actually the advantage of in terms of what Chaitanya Mahaprabhu wanted them to do, because as ministers in the government, they would meet many people. It was a high culture environment. They would learn different languages and so on and so forth. So they had that kind of material background, if you will, added to their Brahmin and Vaishnava birth, which equipped them to deal later, as they did in Vrindavan, with kings and Jiva Goswami in particular. Building temples, and so we'll come to some of that. But at any rate, that they were engaged in the Nawab's service, and they heard about Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, chanted. You can just imagine the whole of Bengal, modern Bengal, is still enchanted by no one person more than Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Well, he's understood what his contribution was, what it's all about. There's no one in Bengal history that stands out more as the poster boy of the glory of Bengal than Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And what to speak of in his time, as his exploits began, news about it began to ripple throughout the subcontinent. By the time Rupa Sanatana met him personally, he had already taken sannyas and gone to Jagannath Puri and conquered the kingdom of Jagannath Puri that the Muslims couldn't conquer. That's how strong it was from martial and political point. Gajapati Raj, Tripurari, the king of Puri at the time, was protected Jagannath Swami and his abode very fiercely Brahmin Muslim invasion. But Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was 24 years old, sannyasi, conquered the king of Jagannath Puri and his minister, the Sarvabhauma, the charges we spoke about the other day. So this kind of news was, as I say, rippling throughout the subcontinent. And Ram Kiri Sanatana heard of the exploits of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and there was some correspondence between them. They wanted to join with him, but they were in a difficult situation working in the king's cabinet. And they didn't have the luxury of just saying, I'm going to quit. It didn't work like that. So it caught him in a difficult place, and they wrote him up. He wrote him a letter. He said, just like a lover pays close attention to her husband, but he may not find out about her extramarital partner. This may occur. So be very careful not to the traditional woman's role at that time. So you keep yourself like that, and your heart beat, or implication of the glory of Vaishnavism, but you will eventually be the architects of under my direction. Have patience, in other words. Keep the flame in your heart burning at the same time. And in due course, of course, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu went to Sanatana. I'm not sure the age difference. Let's see. Jiva Goswami was born in 1513, I believe. I don't know the dates of Sanatana. How much younger that would have made him. I'm not sure that he personally met Chaitanya Mahaprabhu himself, but saw the effect of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. He was old enough to recognize and interact with him, but he saw the profound effect on his father and his nephews. It caused them, at the risk of their own lives, they waited until they found an opening to escape, if you will. Cabinet service, the work they had in the government. Sanatana Goswami dressing himself as a Muslim, wanted to like a fakir or a Sufi, to be able to travel across India and not be caught, and so forth. Beautiful histories of that, stories of that are recorded in Chaitanya Charitamrita. But they met there, and I think at that time the plan was put in place, or the assurance that they would, further assurance from Chaitanya Mahaprabhu personally, that they would have the opportunity to break away from the present situation, meet with them. So the point is that Jiva Goswami saw the effect of his uncles and his father, who left everything. They were wealthy as a result of having very powerful positions in the government. If they had anything they wanted, they gave it up. And it was clear to him that, as I've written in other places, that they did not give up religion for money. They had money. And they didn't give up money, because they did give up only for religion, but for something else. Because had they given that money for religion, that would have been, they did not seek to find a place within the Hindu social religious system for themselves. Social religious status. They gave up social religious status and the money, artha and dharma, altogether. And lo and behold, following the ideal as they understood it of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, they gave up moksha as well. Moksha. In this direction, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's direction. We learn about another dimension which we discussed here. Panchama Purushartha, physical life, Vyatita Bhutani, Prem Prayojan, beyond emotion. So you've read some descriptions of this, how they were captivated by this in the Jiva Goswami Astakam. And you can imagine the young Jiva was also captivated by their example. This really made a deep impression upon him. Said that he had Krishna Balaram deities that he worshipped in his youth. But one day he appeared after his elders had departed and followed Chaitanya before his mother with a saffron robe and shaved head. Just a young lad saying he wanted to go and join his uncles and his father. And of course, she thought it was just a little bit childish preoccupation with something that looked like material misery and religious extremism. But, I think she must have been very surprised to find out that in a short measure, that he was not just a childhood infatuation with the idea, but short of a deep understanding of what that commitment meant. As young son shortly thereafter left home himself. According to Thakur Bhakti Vinod, it's written about this in his Navadvip Mahatmya. Navadvip Mahatmya is one of the books in which Bhakti Vinod Thakur writes about Vrindavan so as to highlight the different places of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's significance of them in ways that the Goswamis, Rupa Sanatana, were asked to do about Vrindavan. He did it on the Navadvip side. And in doing that, one of the main books was called Navadvip Mahatmya, in which he depicts the young Jiva Goswami leaving home and coming to Navadvip and getting the association of Nityananda, who took him on a tour of the Don. So this happened here, this happened here, this happened here. Now, go here, sent him to Benares. Benares is still today a center of learning in India. And from a religious or spiritual point of view, it's a real haven for Advaitins and Buddhists, Mayavadis, Sunnivadis, who are very much, from our point of view, preoccupied with the dry logic of abstract philosophy drawn from the Veda. So it was a place of learning, and Jiva Goswami went there, and he learned under Madhusudana Vachaspati at the time. Well, I think that Rupa Sanatana also had association with that. He was related, Madhusudana Vachaspati, to Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya. Now, Bhattacharya, we spoke about a little bit the other day, but a little bit more about him. It should be noted that I believe he's described in the Encyclopedia Britannica as the greatest logician of all times in India. It's said that he hailed from the Navadvip area. He was his father, I think, was a close associate of Jagannath Mishra, the father of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So when Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was a young lad, 24 years old, a sannyasi from the Puri, he put that together. He was attracted to his beauty, his charm, his learning, and the fact that we have a relationship from the village as well. Somehow the Bhattacharya had relocated in Puri, but it's said about him that he went to Mithila, which previously was the seat of learning in Bengal, and he wanted to take some of the books from there back to his hometown in India, so seat of learning in India. Take the books to Navadvip, but they wouldn't allow him because there was competition over the seat of learning. So he memorized, I think, one of the main books and took it by heart to Navadvip. There he had a student named Raghunandan Thakur, was his name. And he became as celebrated of a logician as he wanted to be. He said he was once riding in a boat across the Ganga, with Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, who was then had yet to manifest himself as a Vaishnava. He was known as Nimai Pandit. He was very learned himself. And Raghunandan and Sridhar said, I've written a book about logic. My desire is that I will become the greatest logician in India. Would you take a look at it, you're a Pandit, see what you think. So Chaitanya Mahaprabhu looked at the book and said, yes, it's very nice. And I have a book too that I've written. And this, of course, perked the interest of Raghunath Shiromani because Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was very famous as a Pandit at the time. But Mahaprabhu said, but after reading the book, I throw it in the mine in the Ganga so that you can become the greatest. The case was, if he had kept the book, that position would not have been gained. That title would not have been gained by him. So whether he did or not, it seems he must be listed in there somewhere, but he was a student of Swami Tirobhava. So at one point, let's talk about the Tirobhava was the most learned Pandit logician, I should say, in India. So pretty elevated, if you will, from one point of view, lineage. And Vachaspati Madhusudan was related to Sarvabhauma. He had a teacher's role in some respect in the lives of Buddha groups and often definitely in the life of Jiva Goswami, who acquainted himself with all the different systems of philosophy at the time. It was a little easier at that time than it is now. At that time, the systems were Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Karma Mimamsa, Sankhya, Yoga, and Vedanta. And all of these philosophical systems, to one extent or another, derived from the sacred texts, from the Veda, Puranas, which were the main standard books of knowledge. The extent to which they relied upon them, the extent to which they considered them evidence as to by which we could know what we know and so forth is different. But that, if you can imagine, is quite different than today, because at a certain point in Western history, philosophy was born, if you will, by what I would say is a discipline of theology, reasoning about the implications of sacred texts. Philosophy, by contrast, would be reasoning unhinged from whatever those old books say. Retiring them to the dustbin and giving oneself the freedom of the mind to just think yourself, do I exist? Existentialist philosophers and so forth. And now philosophy is largely informed by scientific data, thought about. So there's just too many systems of philosophical thought to keep up with. But the example of Jiva Goswami is important because it conforms with what the Bhagavatam cites. If we on top of that cite the commentary of the verse from Srimad Bhagavatam, the Vishnu Chaitanya, the verse that speaks about the qualifications of the Guru, Shabde Parecha Nishnatam, Brahmani Upashamashram. Besides having standing in transcendence, verse says, evidenced by Brahmanishtam, Shabde Parecha Nishnatam, Brahmani Upashamashraya, who has standing in Brahman on the ground of consciousness, who himself are made of, evidenced by their ability to harness the human passions. This is the objective evidence by which we can find their subjective experiences that they report upon to us. We believe that has some credibility because they're talking about supernatural experiences, and the evidence that they're having them, that they're real, is borne out in the objective evidence that they supply to us by their example of being able to harness the human passions, which is supernatural. Understand? We understand that pretty well. It's pretty supernatural. Harness the human passion, harness the human passions. So that's one half of description of the guru, and the other half, Shabde Parechanatam, that he or she understands, has bathed, if you will, in the shower of the Vedic texts from a Shabde Pare means from a theological, theistic, from a theistic perspective. This is the Bhagavatam speaking, rather than from a monistic perspective. It's described in the Guru in this, but from a theistic perspective. Shabde Pareshnishnata means that they understood or bathed in a shower, as I say, of the nectar of the Vedic text from a theistic point of view in every way, shape, and form. They looked at it inside, outside, upside, downside, backside, front side, Nishnatam. And to get to it, in his commentary on this verse, Jiva Goswami says, and not only the scriptural books. So they were, in the Jiva Goswami, understood all these other philosophies outside of Vedanta, the form of Vedanta he was involved in formulating, along with his brothers, Srutanathan, under the direction of the behest of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, being Jiva Goswami, one of that's the architects of the whole Sampradaya. So he was familiar with the currents of philosophy of his time, and thus could speak about the sacred text in a relevant way in the times, drawing from this discipline and that discipline, and that people would have acquaintance with, and so on and so forth. Accepting some aspects, finding common ground, rejecting those philosophies on other grounds, and so on and so forth. So this he accomplished at a young age, and from there he went to Vrindavan. So it's thought that he received initiation from Rupa Goswami himself and was the only disciple of Rupa Goswami, who, along with Sanatana Goswami, we have no real record of them initiating disciples, and one of the reasons for this appears to be a social consideration at the time, given the fact that they were ostracized, as I said earlier, from the Hindu community for having worked in the Muslim government. So they didn't want to push the envelope too far. They're fully qualified to initiate, but based on social considerations, they thought, well, it's not rock the boat here too much. In our midst, we have Gopal Bhatta Goswami from a prestigious South Indian family of Brahmins, Sampradaya. Nobody can object from a social point of view, social religious point of view, to this position, because in the social religious system of Varnashram, the Brahmins would be the initiators, right? So from that point of view, Gopal Bhatta became the main initiator. But in time, things change. And in particular, in relation to our discussion, over time, the Sampradaya, the community of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, a systematic lineage with its text and so forth, was developing. So in time, in, let's say, the next generation, or just in between the two, we find Jiva Goswami because he was young. He did become initiating guru. Of course, he was not working in the government either, so they might not have quite looked at him in the same way and ostracized him, but still, connection with his parents might have, in the eyes of these very, Varnashram was like very detail-oriented. It has to be like this, can't be like that. And who's your mother, who's your father, who's your father, what did you do yesterday, and so on and so forth. We brought this point up before. Bhagavatam is really trying to relax the grip of Varnashram sensibilities on population, that they might breathe easily within the very comforting, liberal, and much more profound, much deeper, farther its trajectory school of Vaishnavism, Vaishnavism in particular. Not an easy task to accomplish. We try to, let's look at the work of my Guru Maharaj, who came to America and Europe, touched down in Central America. Also, on part of his 12-year orbit around the planet, bringing the tidings of Gaura Nitananda. and so forth. We know we are either immediate students of his or a generation or two removed, but seeing the extent of his campaign was extraordinary, and the history of that is recorded. So you can just imagine how we should feel about the Goswamis and what they did out of nothing to carve out the Gaudiya Vaishnavism as a sampradaya, establish it as a lineage, and given some of the odds that were against them, that I'm describing, for example, which were embraced by Mahaprabhu because it's part of his teaching, right? That you don't have to be within the Varnashram system to be a Gaudiya Vaishnava. Its reach extends beyond the limits of what that discipline can accommodate. Groups and others were outside of that. Not for good reason, but by way of the rules of the system and so forth. They became outcasts. Haridas was an outcast. The whole, like we said, the other Mercantile community of Udar the Thakur were outcasts and so forth. Rama thought Krishna must have been an outcast when he saw him. We'll get to that tomorrow or the next day in his picnic. By the time of Jiva Goswami, then he initiated in it would seem in considerably, but his main disciples were those who took Siksha from him. He became, in time, the Siksha Guru for all of the Gaudiya or Oriyan devotees of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, Jagannath Puri, and Bengal. There were many gurus of different, not all as deeply realized as others, and all deferred, if you will, to the Siddhanta of Jiva Goswami, his Siksha. So we know to be his disciples that are famous, if you will, in a succession, are his Siksha disciples, like Srinivasa Acharya, like Shamananda Prabhu. Srinivasa was initiated, I think he was from Sudravarna, was it Srinivasa or Shamananda? Initiated by Gopal Bhatta Goswami, officially. Yeah. And Gopal Bhatta Goswami certainly had much, to offer, everything to offer, but nonetheless, schooled further by Jiva Goswami, who, as I said earlier, amongst the Goswamis, in terms of their writing, wrote more philosophically. His most famous works, perhaps, being the Satsandarbha, the 6 treatises. Sandarbha means like a necklace. And in those treatises, he took verses from the Bhagavatam, selected verses from the Bhagavatam, and put them together like in a necklace to bring out the central teachings of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, understanding of the teachings derived as they are from Srimad Bhagavatam. So it's quite a masterful work. And in contrast to something like Brihad Bhagavatamrita, the first book of the Gaudiyas by Sanatana Goswami, where you have the story of Gopakumar, and you have the story of Narada, or Rupa Goswami's Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. Yes, it's a book on the tattva of rasa. It's on the tattva, how rasa works, but it's not anywhere near in the same sense of philosophical work like the Sandarbha. So you can see that Chaitanya Mahaprabhu drew upon different persons in his time to play significant roles in the dispensation of the gift of Gaur, Nityananda for wide circulation. Gadadhar had his role of great bringing, so on and so forth. The Goswamis, they all had different roles. None of them is better than the other, more important than the other. They all were given roles, so to speak, by the transcendental system, all of which are important today. Of course, now we focused a little bit on the role of Jiva Goswami himself, and it was considerable, and is mostly thought of in terms of his literary legacy, which again was considerable, exceeds in length that of what the other Goswamis wrote, maybe put together, and the philosophical nature of it. And this is important in terms of establishing a sampradaya because the previous Vaishnava sampradayas and Shankar's monistic sampradaya, they are very heady. They all were based on commentaries on the Vedanta Sutra. The sutras are just really very terse, cryptic statements that seek to demonstrate that the Vedas, which are like the jungle of sounds, are speaking a concerted message to show that. But then they're so cryptic that they lend it slightly different interpretations, all of which point to life beyond the mundane, all of which point to controlling the mind, the senses, transcendence being the goal. They have so much in common, but then they have nuanced understandings of the nature of that transcendence and the way to enter there. So they're similar enough to all be called schools of Vedanta. But prior, as I say, to the Goswamis and Chaitanya Vaishnavism, they were those lineages, respected lineages of Vedanta with Vishishta Dvaita, Dvaita Dvaita, Dvaita, and so on. You were very heady people, Indian philosophers who wrote about this. So common people couldn't read this stuff. And it's written in Sanskrit also, which is not the language of the common people. And so if you want to establish a sampradaya, you have to have somebody for their sake that these other groups will acknowledge. You have to speak to them on their terms. You have to speak to other people on other terms. I mean, Goswamis had a universality about their preaching as well. An example of this is, well, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu tried to accommodate the Muslims to some extent with regard to bring them in. He brought Rup Sanatan in, no problem, right? Became leaders. Haridas he brought in. There are other examples of him converting kings, bringing them in. He didn't reject them as the Varnashram would do and call them outcasts and so forth. And in Vrindavan, the Yoga Pith, this very center of Vrindavan, physically at the time, and esoterically to this day, one of the Yoga Piths of the Vrindavan meditative Astakal Leela over the 8 divisions of the day, is the Radha Govinda temple. And that Radha Govinda temple was where the deities of Jiva Goswami, or Rupa Goswami, Radha Govinda were enshrined, and it was built in such a way as to incorporate aspects of Hindu archaeology, architecture, and Muslim architecture. It's a combination of the two. And Jiva Goswami wrote a Govinda Mandir Astakam. So he was involved in this details. So this is again a bit of the universality. They wanted to, it was very inclusive. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's outreach was very, very inclusive. And in order to have that inclusiveness, one feature of that, they'd have to be included, if you will, by the existing schools of Vaishnavism at the time, gain credibility amongst them. So somebody had to, the youngest amongst the founding acharyas, amongst the architects, that guest was given to Jiva Goswami. Rupa Goswami, yes, he wrote about rasa. Yes, he said philosophically speaking, well, Krishna's got more rasa than Narayan, therefore he must be superior. Now let's get on and talk about what bhakti rasa is. So Jiva Goswami goes into it much more deeply, establishes what the scriptural hub of all the scriptural sacred texts is, that being the Bhagavatam, around which all the other texts revolve and will be understood in context by looking at statements in relation to what the Bhagavatam says. Very novel, ingenious insights that he came up with. And he was up to the task, if you will. And you can say that without the writings of Jiva Goswami, texts like the Sandarbhas in particular, you wouldn't have, arguably, you wouldn't have Gaudiya Vaishnavism being thought of as another Vaishnava Sampradaya in school of Vedanta. Now that might not be so important to somebody today in the Western world who doesn't even know what Vedanta is or how to pronounce it or whatever. But at the time, it was important. And in this time, in our time, it's important for people who study the time and what the Indian history is and what the schools of thought are and so forth. And if Gaudiya Vaishnava just had some poets writing about it, it might be a nice thing to look and see. But with this deep philosophical insight and kind of Vedanta-esque in terms of how Vedanta was crafted or developed as a school in the past, this is work of Jiva Goswami. Yes, Mahaprabhu said, well, we don't need a commentary on Vedanta Sutra because the Bhagavatam is a commentary, is a longhand form of the notes of Vyas, because the Buddha Purana says, Artoyam Brahma Sutra. So the art, the meaning of the scripture of the sutras is found in the Srimad Bhagavatam. So, okay, but you're just going to make quote one statement from the Buddha Purana. It's enough for Mahaprabhu, but Jiva Goswami want to follow up on that, right? And demonstrate that. That is his Sandarbhas. Later, century or so or more than a century later, you have Bali Vidyabhushan under certain circumstances, writing his Govinda Bhashya, which is a commentary directly on the sutras, and a need for it at the time, given the circumstances, which is another story, another beautiful history within the Gaudiya Vaishnava lineage and its efforts to establish itself on terms that other people at the time could relate to. So these were very difficult tasks, if you will, as they were given. Don't ask, be careful if you ask for service. You could get something difficult, very difficult. It will tax you. It will tax you. That's very good, right? So you can imagine how taxed they were, right? Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur kind of drew upon that in his own mission by his emphasis that, well, to sit down and remember Krishna 24 hours a day under a tree or in a cave by chanting is not so easy. But if you are to tax your mind how to present this high philosophy to common people in different cultures and so forth, that could keep your mind pretty busy, occupy you. And as a result of doing that for a couple of decades, maybe you can sit down and weep what it's all about. One of my godbrothers once told Prabhupada sannyasi, took sannyas from Prabhupada, said he just wanted to stay in Mayapur, grass hut, and chant. So Prabhupada said, yes, you can try it. So he did it. For a month he was chanting, 100 plus rounds a day and so forth. But he told me that after about 2 weeks, or maybe 10 days, they would bring him one meal a day, put it under the door, right? After about 10 days, he started to think, are they going to give me that same doll again? Is there going to be a sweet on there? Don't they ever make samosas around here? And his mind started to go like that. And from there, it got worse. and before a month was over, he said, obviously, my mind is too powerfully distracted at this time. And my heart is not purified enough for material desires and attractions to be able to drink and eat and get rest from the holy name alone. This is not an easy thing. So he got up and he reported his experience to Prabhupada. And Prabhupada said, so now you go out and preach in 10 years to come back and try again. See what happens. So he's still trying. But that's okay. So they were, yes, there is a description in Chaitanya Charitamrita that's very moving, where Jiva Goswami, where Krishnadas writes, and pilgrims would go to Vrindavan. They were the talk of Vrindavan, the Goswamis. And when pilgrims would go and come back, and then people outside of Vrindavan would ask, what are Rupa and Sanatana and Jiva Goswami? What are they doing? This was their reputation. Jiva Goswami himself writes about his uncles at the onset of each of the 6 Sandarbhas, he pays respect to them. And I've cited this before. He says, I offer my pranam to Rup Sanatan, who are famous as devotees in Mathura, in the Manda, Braj. And the significance of that is considerable. Just to be in the Braj, and just to be a devotee in Braj, to acknowledge as such by that's significant. But to be famous as devotees in Braj without trying is what they're standard, without trying. It brings up somewhat of a difference in the disposition of Rupa and Jiva Goswami that equipped them, if you will, to contribute in the ways that they did through their writings to the Sampradaya. There's a story, a couple of anecdotes come to mind. One in which a scholar came and had written something and wanted to debate Rupa and Sanatana in public, so that he would be known as the greater scholar, which he was making an endeavor to do, which they had become without trying, if you will. And so they after a few requests from this fellow, they said, look, we don't really have time for this. Just give us write it up on paper. I debated with Rupa Sanatana and defeated them. We'll sign it. And then you can just leave us alone. So they would go around and say, yeah, I debate. You know, but of course, listen to that. So this was their disposition. But the other anecdote is that in discussions with Vallabha, who was a contemporary of the Goswamis, and who had met Mahaprabhu also, he met Mahaprabhu he I don't know if it was the first time, but on one occasion in not Puri, before that, was it at Ashvamedha Ghat, where he met Rupa. And there he was meeting with Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Vallabha was a big scholar and a Vaishnava. And at that time, when he was meeting with Mahaprabhu, Rupa and Vallabha had arrived. And they paid their obeisances to Chaitanya Mahaprabhu at a distance. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and Vallabha noticed them, and he went to say, "Oh, please get up." And Mahaprabhu said, "Don't touch them. They're outcasts." Testing him. And Vallabha said, he picked up on it. He said, "How can they be outcast when their lips are constantly chanting the holy name?" We saw, without trying, their tongues were moving and the name was chanting and they were weeping. And so Mahaprabhu was pleased with Vallabha meditation. But in Vrindavan, he had some complaint about something that Rupa had written in Bhakti-rasamrita Sindhu. This must have been in the context of writing it and maybe sharing some part of the manuscript and so forth with another scholar. And in one verse, Jiva Goswami describes, if you study it carefully, which Jiva Goswami did, that the desires for karma and gyan are like witches that come to haunt the heart. And unless the house of the heart is freed from these desires for gyan, knowledge unto itself, or karma, things, desires for things, or desire to get away from things, one or the other, then bhakti won't reside in that haunted house to that extent. So you have to bring her in and chase them out a little bit. So that's what the Jiva Goswami's understanding of the verse was. But on its face, somehow Vallabha, this is the story anyway, history gets lost a little bit over time, centuries, but this is from the oral tradition and it's famous, that Vallabha said, you can't call karma and gyan witches. These are paths given in the sacred text. Indeed, there's an offense to the holy name that says one should not blaspheme the Vedas, which means that one should not, as a bhakta, one should not criticize unduly the paths of karma and gyan that have a place for people who who only have eligibility for those paths and as yet lack eligibility in bhakti. Now we can criticize them by way of comparison to bhakti to create eligibility in bhakti. But that's another thing. That's an art, right? Otherwise, these are given in the Vedas. So he took exception to what Rupa had written, and he went away, and Vallabha followed him. Or excuse me, Jiva Goswami followed him. Story goes, and I think he went to bathe in the Ganga, and he assisted him. And he said, "By the way, you criticized that verse, but this is the actual meaning of the verse, and you were wrong. This is his elder. This is what he was like." And so then the news came back to Rupa Goswami. It seemed like a good thing. It is. But Rupa Goswami rejected him. So you can stay here. You're wasting your time in arguing with people. Just arguments over philosophy. You're wasting your time. We have our philosophy of beliefs. People argue against it, whatever. We're going on with it. We're doing it. This seems to be a difference in their disposition. Jiva Goswami was banished, went to Radhakund area. There he was living in a cave, and fasting, and Sanatana Goswami came upon him and saw him in this condition. Then brought it up quietly to Rupa Goswami, accepted it back in. But it's a story that I think illustrates to some extent the difference in the disposition of Jiva Goswami and his own guru, Rupa Goswami, which really equipped Jiva Goswami to do the task that he was ordained to do, and it was not within the nature of Rupa Goswami or even Sanatana Goswami to do, or rather Das Goswami. Gopal Datta, Prabhupada didn't write anything. So he had a certain philosophical mind and made a big contribution that was relatively important. It's one aspect of what was required to establish the sampradaya, and which even today, in today's world, amongst scholars, Indologists, whatnot, it has gone a long way to bring attention to the poetry of Rupa Goswami, then, and the beautiful ideas and the Leela narratives of the Goswamis. And I don't mean to say that none of their other books have much philosophy, but comparatively, there's a significant difference. So there's room for different dispositions, different ways in which serve. And we heard a little bit about Jiva Goswami, and we owe a great debt to him. I've said, written poetically elsewhere, something to the effect that Jiva Goswami was he actually took the Bhagavatam as his, like a sculptor, as a tool, and used it to carve out the deity of Krishna's too. Bhagavan Swami displayed it before the whole world. As we've heard before, this is the most significant cornerstone of the philosophical foundation of Gaudiya Vaishnavism. So where would we be without Jiva Goswami today? We have the definitive editions of the Sandarbhas being published by the Jiva Institute. So his influence remains today and has inspired a modern day institute to carry on that type of philosophical legacy. So we need that in the world too, besides foolish people like me. That's enough. So Jiva Goswami Prabhupada ki jai, Shri Gaur Nityananda ki jai, Gaudiya Vaishnava Sampradaya ki jai, Shri Raji Gopal ki jai, Gaur Bhakta Vrinda ki jai, Gaur Premanandi. I see Ravini Nanda is there. I see Vamsi Dhari is there. I see so many nice devotees. There's Doctor, my doctor from Canada. So nice to be with all of you today. Any question? Yes? You're wondering about Gopal Bhatta Goswami.
About Rupa Goswami.
Rupa Goswami.
Is it exactly in his line? Because he's the Advaita Tattva. Exactly.
The question is about Rupa Goswami and the term Rupa Nuga. And why is it that we are all followers of Rupa Goswami because he's the Abhideya Tattva Acharya, the Acharya that presides over the way, the path, the means. Abhideya. He wrote Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, Ujjval Nilamani. These books are about the way. And so the question is along those lines. Well, Rupa Goswami has shown the way. That's true. Not that others haven't, but that's emphasis on Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. What is bhakti? What is sadhana bhakti, which is the way, which leads to bhava bhakti, how that works, what is prema bhakti, what is bhakti rasa, its constituent elements, this bhava, that bhava, sthaya bhava, samchari bhava, and so on, separate bhava, so on. And then what is each rasa? Shantadasa, Satyavacharya, primary, what the secondary rasa is. What is conflicting rasas, and so on and so forth, how they mix and how they don't mix. That's his tome, right? Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, very important book. And but the question is, are we all Rupa Nugas because he's the one who shows the way? I'm not. I think that the term Rupa Nuga was first coined by Raghunath Das Goswami in maybe the last verse, if I'm right, if I remember correctly, of Manashiksha. And if we look at that carefully, he refers to Rupa Goswami himself as a Rupa Nuga. Nuga means to follow, a follower of Rupa in terms of the Yuta group that he's in. On the one hand, internally, Rupa Goswami is a handmaiden of Radha. Rupa Manjari. There the word Rupa means beauty. Rupa Manjari is thought to be an incarnation or expansion of the beauty of Radha. All these internal associates of Radha, so many gopis, they're different aspects of herself, personified, if you will. So Krishna is actually monogamous. You never know it on the surface, but all the different moods of Radha personified to one extent or another to make for the interplay of rasa. So, Rupa Goswami, he was a Goswami. As Rupa, he's Rupa Manjari, so the very beauty of Radha. He's just a young girl, very, very beautiful, prepubescent girl in Braj, handmaiden of Radha, Krishna's consort. And he's a Goswami. He's Rupa, and he's a Goswami. He has control of his mind and senses. So he has control of his mind and his senses, and he's wild about Krishna at the same time. Wild about Krishna. Of course, if you go into depth of the Manjari Bhav, we see it's a romantic but platonic at the same time relationship that he has with Krishna. It's complicated, right? It's a particular type of rasa. So Raghunath Das Goswami is following in that same path. And he coins the term Rupa Nuga, and for the most part, it refers to those who follow Rupa Goswami in terms of that bhava. But of course, let's take, for example, Sakyaras, which we've talked about, and we have some affinity for, that I've written about. I mean, there's no one that has revealed more about Sakyaras in the history of Hinduism than Rupa Goswami, and it is immense. Different types of Sakya-rasa, nuances within that, what it constitutes, examples and so forth. I mean, where he's getting all that, he has original verses that he uses to explain some of the philosophical points that he makes. He borrows some and draws from some other texts, but much of it is original. It's extremely insightful. I mean, there are other people that seem to have some affinity for Sakya, some poets and whatnot, in and around the time thereafter, before Rupa Goswami, but no one has made a contribution like him. Mostly you see something like, what is it called? Swacha? Swacha. Like Samanya, Swacha, Shanta. Prior to Shantaras, he has some affinity for this. You can find in some of these Brijbas poets that they have some affinity for Sakya. I don't know whether they're talking over here about some affinity for Madhurya Ras. Over here, some affinity for Vatsali Ras. It hasn't become fixed in one way and centered on one bhav, a sthayi bhav, out of which actual bhakti rasa can arise. And this all explained by Rupa Goswami. We can differentiate between their experience and what Rupa Goswami is talking about. So how can we, if we have interest in Sakya Bhava, not emphasize our regard for and show deference to Rupa Goswami in a broader sense? We also follow Rupa Goswami, the Anugas. We're following with what he teaches about Sakya Rasa. And of course, he follows Nityananda Prabhu, whom we also follow, because Heno Nitai Bine Pai by Radha Krishna Bhite Nai. No one can get close to Radha Krishna without going through Nityananda Prabhu. Nityananda Swarup Ki Jai. And so there's a couple of ways to look at the term Rupanuga. Prabhupada, my Guru Maharaj, always wrote about it in the latter way, in a broader way, following the teachings of Rupa Goswami. But there's much to be said for the idea that the full sense of Rupanuga is following the teachings of Rupa Goswami and entering into the same bhava, pursuing the same bhava as Rupa Goswami, having that as one's ideal. But unfortunately, things like this get used as battering rams to create sectarian boundaries and bruises within Gaudiya Vaishnavism. You like Sakya Rasa, you're not a Rupanuga. Punch. Maybe not. What do you think? And all these cycles come punch, punch, punch. Not a good. This is not a good way to deal with these very, very sensitive topics and what rasa means. Who are the embodiments of this Nityasiddha Krishna Prem in Braj, and how they are the dearest thing to Krishna. Krishna corresponds with them. Without them, there is no Krishna in Braj. Without the love, there's no object of the love. You can't have one without the other. So we should tread very carefully talking about all these things. We bow to all of such rasas. At one time, I had a discussion with Pramod Puri Goswami Maharaj, because Prabhupada, of course, written a famous poem in which he expressed his desire for attaining Sakya Rasa, his identification with that as his ideal. And I read it to Puri Maharaj, and his eyes lit up when he heard that verse. And, oh, Sakya Rasa. And I said, yes, and some people are saying, this I heard came through. Some people are saying that because my Guru Maharaj is in Sakya Rasa, if you want to attain Madhurya Rasa, you're going to have to go somewhere else. And I was taking exception to this, and Puri Maharaj did as well. I just wanted to get his confirmation. And he said, Baba, he said, he was like over 100 years old at the time, and he was kind of animated by the discussion. He said, sometimes I would go and sit with Puri Maharaj and then in darshan, and then he would leave and I'd stay and ask if I could stay with him and chant japa in his presence, because it's good. He always gave me permission. So anyway, he said, Baba, if you have a guru situated in Sakya Rasa, and you think you have a problem, you have a problem. He will make all arrangements, he said. And there are examples of this too in the Sampradaya. So these are, to have connection with that realm, to have standing in that realm, that is significant, rare, desirable. Sudurlabha bhagavata loke. Sudurlabha. What does that verse say? Can't hear you, brother. Anyway, that's the last one. Stu Dulaba Bhagavatam. This describes the Vaishnava. Touch him or to see them. Akshno phalam taduchagat prasanna akshno phalam. Akshno, to see him, the perfection of the eyes, to touch the expression, the profession of Sangha, to speak about him, the perfection of the tongue. Such a person, Sudurlabha Bhagavata, in this local, in this world, Sudurlabha Bhagavata, very rare to find such a Bhagavata. So, to all such Bhagavatas, we owe our respect. Bring an end to this, but with this, I cited Rupa Goswami and his relationship with this Vallabhacharya, who has some different ideas than some of the Gaudiya Vaishnava Mahaprabhu accepted. And Rupa Goswami in his book, Bhakti-Rasmrita Sindhu, in 2 places, he says, and there's others, Pushti Marg, there's others, the Mariada Marg, and they're more or less the same. These are terms that refer to the Vaidhi and the Raganuga side in the Vallabha Sampradaya. So let's speak of our own Sampradaya. We should be generous with one another, especially with regard to these types of topics, and the fact that they may have touched someone, some rays of what that love constitutes may have touched someone in this world. We'll examine, is it really true? And we'll see that feeling is well supported, well understood, well grounded. We need to step back, show some regard for that, the hope that we'll be blessed. We find the prayers of Rupa Goswami himself, for example. What does it say? Rupa Goswami praying to Subal. Where did you learn that verse? Where did you learn it? So there we go. See, I know the verse. So there Rupa Goswami is praying, oh, Subal, you will know. You are the friend of the son of Nanda and the daughter of Vrishabhanu, Maharaj in Vrindavan. When will you bless me that you bring me in their proximity? In Rupa Goswami praying in the bhava of a bhava, Jatarag sadhaka, one who has bhava, praying in that mood. Bring me in touch with that divine couple. You can do that. No one can bring them better together, better than you. And if you can bring me to them. So this is how we should regard all these different processes. So we pay our respect to all the examples of it. Shri Bachila ki jai, Shri or Parshadas ki jai, or Parshadas Shri Krishna Balaram Associates ki jai. Oh, Premanande. Nice to be with you all. Hari Hari.